This is Tell Me What to Read, the podcast of booktopia.com.au. I'm your host, Nick Wasiliev, and today I'm excited to bring you the first of 3 special podcasts this week. First up today, Ben Hunter sits down with Jane Caro, author of The Mother, which has been selected as our Book of the Month for March 2022. Head to our website right now for a special offer on this title. You can also check the show notes below for timestamps for all interviews, as well as links to all books mentioned. Lastly, this interview contains references to abuse, sexual assault, and violence against women. Listener discretion is advised. If you or anyone you know is suffering from the issues raised in this podcast, there is help available. You can reach out to White Ribbon Australia at 1-800-RESPECT or 1-800-737-732. Now, over to Ben's interview with Jane Caro on The Mother, our pick for the Book of the Month for March 2022.
Hi, I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager, and on the podcast with me today is Jane Caro. She is a Walkley Award-winning journalist, a social commentator, a broadcaster, advertising writer, documentary maker, and author. And now she's adding to that list, she's a federal Senate candidate and a frustrated Wordle solver.
Yeah.
Her first novel for adults is out now, and it is called The Mother. We love it so much at Booktopia, we've made it our book of the month for March. I'll tell you more about that soon. But I'm also going to give a trigger warning at the very tippy top of this. This book is a frank discussion of domestic violence and murder. If you or someone you love is going through anything of that variety, I recommend a hotline, 1-800-RESPECT. It is excellent and it is staffed 24 hours a day. That is 1-800-RESPECT or 1800-737-732. Jane Caro, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving that trigger warning and, place that people can go if they need help. Very important.
Jane, this novel reflects on one of the most heartbreaking failings of our modern society, but it also asks one of the oldest ethical questions of time immemorial. Would you take a life to save a life? So why don't you just start by telling us about the novel in your own words?
Sure. Well, basically, the novel is about a woman who's lived a very privileged life. She's, comfortable financially, good marriage, 2 nice daughters. She's got a few niggles here and there. Her relationship with the youngest daughter isn't quite the way she'd like it to be. Good. But unfortunately, life doesn't stay pretty good. And she goes on a roller coaster ride, really, because of the marital choices that her youngest daughter makes. At first, Miriam, the mother of the title, thinks that the man who's come into Ali's life like a kind of whirlwind, a real whirlwind romance, is the answer to a mother's dreams. Forget about a maiden's dreams, because this difficult daughter of hers has finally found someone who can take responsibility for her, love her, and Miriam's kind of off the hook. And there's a lot of relief in that, really. And then slowly, as time goes on, Miriam starts to realise that this relationship she had such high hopes for, and that obviously her daughter had high hopes for, is not what it seems. And it becomes more and more extreme, to the point where Miriam and Ali eventually, after quite a few years, realise that Ali and her children, her 2 small children, Isla and Teddy's lives are at serious risk. And I mean, given the headlines that we've all seen over the last goodness knows how long, it must be hard for anyone watching someone they love in a violent or coercively controlled relationship without fearing that it could go to extreme lengths. And this book looks at what happens when you become convinced that it is, what a loving parent is prepared to do in those situations, and if they do take extreme action, what the result of that would be, how that might play out. And basically, there's a dilemma at the heart of the novel, and Ben, you summed it up perfectly. Is it right to take a life to save a life? And the novel doesn't, I think, and I don't have an answer to that. And I think part of our problem with the messy world of relationships is there are no hard and fast answers. There is no clear right and clear wrong. And in this book, that is also true. Miriam says all the way through, I have done the wrong thing, a terribly wrong thing, but I did it for the right reasons. And I think we need to look at that. And the book doesn't pretend to have the answers. I guess the book is really trying to make us all face the question.
It certainly does that. It's a book I read, Jane, at breakneck speed. And usually I like to savor books. This wasn't a matter of me not liking the prose and wanting to rush through it, but the content is heavy, and it is a book that I had to know what happens. So I couldn't stop reading this thing once I was in it without feeling just ill, just total unease. It's a thriller true and true in that sense, and it's very effective. I want to know, Jane, about the creative process of putting it together. Did it come in a creative burst, or was it a project that you really had to stew on?
It was more of a creative burst, I suppose. I had the idea, it arrived whole in my head. And sometimes when you get, particularly I think when you're writing fiction, when you get those ideas, there's an insistence that comes with them. The idea keeps saying to you, you have to write this, you have to write this. I was very daunted by it because I thought, do I want to go to those dark places? I'm not, yes, I know a bit about domestic violence. I've certainly campaigned about it and that kind of thing, but I'm not an expert. I'm not Jess Hill, do I really want to go there? But I asked around to a few people who work in the sector, Annabelle, Daniel in particular, and they were very encouraging and said, we really need fiction because it will reach a different audience. Non-fiction about this issue is really important. We need that. It's vital, but it reaches a certain kind of reader. We need this to get out and be read by more people. And in a way, writing a thriller, and it had to be a thriller because of the nature of the idea, is a way of drawing in an audience that comes for the thrills, which they will get, but stays for the social impact and the dilemma at the heart of the book. And therefore, what I really think that fiction does particularly well, better in a way than non-fiction, and I write both, of course, and I value both equally, but they do different jobs, is I think fiction takes us into compassion, because if we're really enjoying a book, we're actually traveling imaginatively with the characters. So we're identifying with them, we're caring about them, we're worrying about what happens to them. We're not in judgment. We're not looking at them from afar and judging them. We may approve or disapprove their actions, but we're not judging them. We're in there with them. And hopefully the author, and in this case that's me, has convinced you of the fact that the motives behind even an unimaginable action are understandable. Even if the result may be shocking, you sort of understand how they got there. And I think that's the essence of compassion. To come out of judgment and into compassion enables us to start to understand a problem in a more human way. I mean, so many people, when they hear about domestic violence, things like, why didn't she just leave? Oh, well, she shouldn't have stopped him seeing the kids. There's so many judgments that are passed. And people tend to think that women who get into these relationships have some sort of deficit. There's something wrong with them. Got attracted to the wrong man. I want to take all those myths and break them up into little pieces because I don't think they're right. And I hope that's what the book does. And so, yeah, it came in a creative burst. I had a lot of help from my editor at Allen and Unwin, Ali Laveau, who was just fantastic. But I wrote it the way it insisted that I write it. So the fact that does hold people's, and I've heard that response you gave is one I've had a lot, which is very gratifying, of course, is more because I was gripped, I think, than I desired to grip you. It was more that I was gripped as I was writing it.
Yeah, you touch on quite succinctly the kind of the value of framing things in fiction versus framing them in non-fiction. It's storytelling is a hard and fast route to compassion. That must mean this is potentially an even heavier emotional lift for you to try and put this onto the page. You write some very heavy content in this book, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it's a nail biter. It's some things you read are heinous, and it's a logical extreme. I think you need to set up with the reader to test the ethical question properly. You know, it has to go to the extreme.
It has to go to the extreme.
How did you sleep writing that?
That was actually really the worst time. I had so many conflicting emotions. I was terrified that I might have jumped the shark, but I knew I had to really go into the darkest of dark places. That was necessary. So I reached out at that time for support. And like one of the things I did was an old school friend of mine, we were in primary school together, is now one of Australia's top family court lawyers. And I remember sending him an email going, oh, for God's sake, you know, Duncan, have I done that? Am I completely off the rails here? Is this just all, you know, rubbish, blah, blah, blah. Told him some of the dark things. And he came back to me and said, oh, Jane, you've just summarised half the files on my desk. Now, that's gratifying for an author who's struggling with is this working? But it was devastating from the point of view of, oh, my God, what kind of world do we have where there are so many toxic relationships where terrible things happen? And I think that's the thing perhaps we're starting to find out, is that we call some things extreme that actually should be extreme, but may not be. They may be much more common, I'm not going to say normal, but common, than we've allowed ourselves to be aware of. And right up front, Annabelle Daniel gave me a judgment, the judges summing up in the terrible case where Simon Gattani was accused and convicted of throwing his then girlfriend over the balcony of a high-rise building in Sydney, and said this is a brilliant summation of coercive control and how it works. And so right from the start, I was taken to how dark this can get in real life. Forget about in a novel, in real life. And so I slept, I suppose, because I felt a sense of we need to understand how real this is, and how many people, most of them women and children, literally live in terror. And I don't think this is new. That's the other thing. I think that this has been the reality for an awful lot of people for probably as long as there have been humans in relationships. And it feels now so urgent for us to stop pretending that it doesn't happen and only noticing when it reaches the absolute undeniable stage, but actually have some understanding of how people get there.
To do that, I admire that you've framed it not in, you haven't framed this in a dire circumstance. This is happening to a middle class, well-to-do group of people. Yeah. And at the center of your story is Miriam, who's the most excellent, relatable mum. As you say, she's not perfect, but she's doing well. She's a real estate agent in the northern suburbs of Sydney, and she's got 2 great daughters and a very human husband, and she has a very mature and nuanced relationship with him. Like, I love the character of Miriam as much as I could love a real estate agent. Yeah. And I feel like that's
put a bit of grit in there.
Choice. But that's got to be a conscious choice to make sure this is a protagonist that readers can very quickly get on side with, that can be related to and respected, and then to walk her into that horror show over the years and have it get progressively worse and worse.
Yeah, but I felt strongly it had to be like that, because we had to actually think to ourselves, because when I had the idea, it came out of this thought. It was in response to one of those horrific murder-suicides where I was just so devastated reading about it and seeing photographs and everything. And I remember thinking, and I've got 2 daughters and grandchildren, and I remember thinking, lovely son-in-laws, I have to say quickly, I remember thinking, what if that was one of my girls in that situation? What would I do? How would I feel? What would I do? And then I thought, well, I know what I'd want to do. And that got me thinking about how all of us can relate from that perspective of wanting to protect the people we love most in the world from real harm. And that made me start to think about this idea of getting us all to empathize with this terrible situation. And I think we have a bit of a flaw, I think, across our society at the moment about the way we think about trauma and crisis. In a way, we protect ourselves from empathy about people who find themselves in trauma and crisis, because if we empathize, we have to accept that life is chancy and terrible things can happen to anyone. If, however, we stay in judgment and we keep out of empathy, we can say, oh, well, that would never happen to me because I would never do X, Y, Z. I would never marry a man like that. I would leave if anyone did anything like that. We can sort of distance ourselves from the situation. And the problem with doing that, whilst it might protect us, our own feeling of safety, it becomes a judgment on the people who were unlucky enough to find themselves in such an unsafe place. And that is not helpful. That is, in fact, quite cruel. And the fact that you're safe and you are cruel to maintain that sense of safety is what I want to challenge to some extent. I want to say to people, it could be you, it could be anyone, it could be the most ordinary, nice, respectable family down the road. And we keep finding that. I mean, some research came out only a week or so ago. If it had come out, while I was writing the book, I would have gone, yee, because it basically said that 33%, they analysed all the domestic homicides, and they said that 33% of the men who go on to kill their partners and sometimes their children have never shown any sign of violence. They function very well in the world. People like them. No one has a clue that behind closed doors they're behaving in this bizarre way. And I think that's what I wanted to tap into, that it's not a monster and it's not some poor, pathetic, girl who can't defend herself, who lives in a housing commission somewhere. It's not that at all. It's that and much more, and could be any of us. And so, yes, I knew we had to identify and like the mother, though I didn't want her to be, treacly or perfect. She had to be a real person. But yes, that was very important to me.
On the other side of that question, what if it was your daughter? There's the question, what if it was your son? And the character of Miriam, we read from her perspective, but she goes to the wedding. She sits across from the parents of the groom, and you needed to bring those characters to life as well, and ask yourself the question of how would they react to this scenario? How did you go about writing that?
Well, I just imagined. I've got a grandson. I don't have a son, but I have a grandson. And one of the things that has always worried me about the kind of misogyny in society and the acceptance of casual misogyny and sexism is that not only does it groom our daughters to be vulnerable as victims, but it grooms, and this is almost worse to me, it grooms our sons to be tempted to misuse their power and be predators, which we see far too often amongst certain types of school kids, older people. We just see it far too often, this idea that to be a man is to be a predator. Just look at most children's clothing. All the girls, if they've got animals on them. It's bunny rabbits, kittens, and butterflies. If it's on the boys, it's wolves, sharks, gorillas, foxes. It's predators. I mean, I don't know if we could have a clearer message. The way we talk about romance, the chase, swept her off her feet. It's all about conquest. It's all about ownership, and it's all about grabbing and taking the woman that you want. So I thought about all of that. I thought about a conventional family who didn't think terribly deeply about those things. Probably if they thought about them at all, they thought, oh, yeah, that's normal, that's natural, that's the way it should be. I didn't want to demonize them as terrible people who did terrible things. I hint that there may have been some quirks in the upbringing of Nick, but I didn't want to go into a backstory on Nick because Miriam and Alison don't know about it. And also I didn't want to sort of say, oh, we can't blame the men because this is what happened to them, although I have empathy for Nick. I do actually think we don't want a society that encourages our sons to grow up to be or to be able to justify letting the darkest side of themselves unleashed. We all have dark sides to ourselves. Every novelist worth his salt knows that. But the point of civilization and good upbringings and the law is to keep that side under control, not allowed out to wreak havoc. But sometimes in the way that we teach our sons what it is to be a man, which is to basically reject all vulnerability, all softness, or kindness, or weakness, or nurturing, we actually predispose them, not intentionally, we don't mean to do this, to becoming a kind of possible, let that dark side out and feel entitled to do so as proof of masculinity. But I had tremendous empathy all the way through, as does Miriam, for Sally, Nick's mother. And in fact, she is most ashamed and guilty when she thinks of the effect what she has done has had on Sally. But the therapist, of course, that Miriam sees does actually kind of open the frame on that a bit, not just for Miriam, but also I hope for the reader that had what Miriam so feared come to pass, Sally would have been even worse off.
Yes. Oh my goodness! What it's really tragic just to reflect on. And yeah, it's powerful stuff. One other thing I wanted to get at. Yes, you take the reader to the darkest possible place and express some heinous stuff, but domestic violence and coercive relationships, as I've witnessed them, are so much more than that. You write very carefully the insidiousness of the relationship and the control and how one partner can manipulate and isolate so effectively, and how that happens over time, and how they manage to do it without people realizing, even well-educated, well-balanced people. And that extends to the friends and family, obviously. And Miriam herself is undermined and isolated and in times humiliated. How is that process of putting those aspects onto the page? Was that even in a sense more of a challenge?
Well, yeah, it was, to get the pacing right, to get the drip of the confusing messages that Miriam's getting, because Nick often does things that seem to be very caring about his wife and full of concern about her, and worried, because of course he begins to get Miriam to believe that Ali has postnatal depression, or possibly even worse, postnatal psychosis, and that therefore everything he does is out of concern for her and love for her and the desire to help her get better. And Miriam, having had her own struggles with Ali, is well placed to believe all this, and Ali's own actions, which we, towards the end of the novel, start to understand why she does what she does, seem to confirm what Nick is saying about his wife. And so I have empathy for everyone caught up with an arch manipulator, because most of us are not arch manipulators. So we don't go through life expecting that people are telling us the absolute opposite of what is true. I mean, perhaps we could explain the Trump phenomenon a bit like that, that he just says the opposite of what's going on and people believe it because A, they want to, and B, they're not used to thinking that this person is that someone can just stand up there and say, no, the world is not as you see it, it is like this, and deny reality. But of course, that is how you gaslight someone, you deny their reality. So yes, it was hard to do. It was also, to be honest with you, and this sounds terrible, but you have to enjoy writing a book to finish it. It was exciting and interesting to have to do it from a technical writerly perspective and feeling like you've been convincing. And all I kept thinking to myself is how easily I could be made to think, oh, maybe the way I see things isn't the way they are. Maybe I am wrong about that. It's a very easy thing to do to people. We've watched an entire globe have that kind of undermining happen over climate change. Oh, it's not settled. Oh, there was these scientists who think differently. In a way, we've been gaslighted about that for a decade or more. And so we're very used to it. But the more we understand how it works, the less vulnerable all of us will be, I hope.
Well said. Jane, you dedicate this novel to your mother, Kate. Can you tell me a little bit about her?
Well, my mother's amazing. I'm very lucky. Both my parents are still alive and hale and hearty. They're both, my mother's 90 now. My father turns 90 in April. And my mother's a lifelong feminist, a very intelligent, but until she was in her 40s, undereducated, didn't get the kind of opportunities to go to university and that kind of thing because she was a girl. That was the only reason. And, if my mother had been born when I was born, she would have been a professor of history, no question about it, or a professor of politics. I mean, she's got a brilliant academic mind. She's an awesome researcher, and she has achieved a great deal. She, in fact, was a relationships counsellor as a career and did go to university late in life. But, she brought up 4 children. She didn't love being a mother. We were very clear on the fact that she did not love being a mother, and she certainly loathed being a housewife, but she loved us. And she certainly gave her daughters the sorts of messages I think that made a big difference to us, which was don't do what I did. Don't become a secretary and then get married young and have lots of children. Do not do that. That is not a good way to live your life. And the funny thing is, she and my dad adore each other and have been married for, must be getting close to 70 years, I suppose. Well, it must be 67 years they've been married now. They're very close, and he's always, he thinks she's the smartest person he's ever met. He's probably right. And so I wanted to dedicate the book to her because I don't think I would have been able to do any of the things that I've done without her honesty about her own life, because a lot of people pretend they're enjoying lives that they're not, particularly to their children. I think telling the truth is better.
And Janice, speaking of everything you do,
Yes.
You're taking a stand for election in 2022, federal election. You're going to stand for the Reason Party for the Senate. About that, a lot of people probably aren't unaware of the Reason Party yet and what they do, what their ideological platform is. So enlighten us.
Okay, so Reason Australia is a fairly new party, but it is formed out of coming together of Fiona Patten's Sex Party. Fiona Patten's a fairly well-known political figure in Australia, particularly in Victoria, where she's been in the upper house there for about 7 years. She's very effective. She's gotten some really wonderful things through. Most recently, in the last few weeks, she was very instrumental in helping getting sex work decriminalised in Victoria. But she's joined forces with the Voluntary Euthanasia Party, which has also been really effective at getting voluntary assisted dying laws in Victoria and in many other states. And it looks like they might be about to pass in New South Wales as well, which would be really wonderful. So these are proven effective at getting policy actually done operators. And they came to me and asked me if I'd be interested in standing for them in the Senate. And I looked at their policies and I agreed with just about everything they said. And I also really liked their emphasis on evidence-based policy that listens to the experts and makes decisions on the basis of what will minimise harm, diminish suffering, and enhance people's lives without worrying about ideological considerations or religious belief or anything. What's going to actually fix this and make it better? What's going to help the people who are suffering from whatever it is we're looking at? What's going to make the world better if we do X or Y? And I really like that approach. I don't know, I've got a problem. Let's look for the best answer and implement that one. It's often what we do outside of politics, but it's far too rare in politics. And hence the name Reason Australia. Let's actually use what we've got up here as much as we use our heart and our gut. We've gone a little bit too far into the heart and the gut and forgotten to turn on our brain. And I'm not saying you don't use your heart and your gut. Of course, I'm a novelist. But like a good novel, they need to be integrated. Your brain needs to be working with your heart and your gut for a book to be a good book. And your brain needs to be working with your heart and your gut for a policy to be a good policy. And we're not seeing nearly enough of that. So I was very attracted, and also looking at Australia, where it is today, the kind of leadership we have at the moment, it just doesn't feel like we're actually looking at the future at all. And we're certainly not looking at tackling the really wicked problems that we're facing. And it's getting urgent. I mean, the Queensland, we're sitting here now where a once in 100-year flood has just happened again within a few years. You know, we're starting to say, oh, maybe the scientists were right. Yes, what a surprise. Of course they're right. You know, they've created the rest of the world that we live in. When we got a pandemic, who found the solution to it within a miraculously short time? Okay, not a perfect solution, but we're a hell of a lot better off with the vaccines than we were without them. Scientists. But what have we done? To what? Benefit profits and the fossil fuel lobby and people who had invested in digging stuff out of the ground and don't want to be a stranded asset? We fundamentally undermined trust in science and the scientific method and evidence. And what have we ended up with? QAnon and the anti-vaxxers and the, freedom protests and Donald Trump. I mean, it's a disaster. And I know I'm standing for a small party. I'm just one person, I'm going to give it a really good shot, but getting into the New South Wales Senate is, it is tough. You need a lot of votes. But we've all got to do something. If we're going to stay in a sane and reasonable world where people actually do things that make a good difference, we've all got to stand up and do what we can. And it seemed to me that I had to practice what I preached. So that's what I'm doing.
Well, power to you. It's going to be a big year for you, Jane.
It sure is.
And it's if you're a progressive, that is a very robust and good policy platform from my perspective as just one voter. So, hey,
I'm totally progressive. It's all, I am not. I'm not interested in neoliberalism on any level. In fact, it astonishes me that we keep electing governments that don't believe in government. That would seem to me to be something that would exclude them from consideration. We need leadership. We need governments.
Yeah, and I think if Labor win the federal election in the lower house, I think the people we have in the upper house, if Labor win, it will be by probably not a massive margin. And I think the upper house will really matter. And I think who we have in the upper house will really matter. So
that's my thinking too.
Yes. We're out of time, but I want to, thank you again for writing this incredible novel, for everything you do, and for taking a little bit of time out of what's going to be a very, very busy schedule for you
It is pretty
to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. I love Booktopia. You're an awesome organisation, and you're Australian.
Jane, thank you. And thank you for signing books for us and everything that you do. The Mother is published by Allen & Unwin. It is out now, and it is our March book of the month. That means for the month of March, there is a very special price on it for a limited time. So check it out, booktopia.com.au.
Thanks to Jane Caro. You can find links to all of the books discussed today in our show notes, or head over to booktopia.com.au. Stay tuned for our next episode tomorrow in our traditional Wednesday slot, where we sit down with Sarah Runke, director of the Brisbane Writers Festival, to discuss the upcoming 2022 iteration of the festival. Then join us on Friday for a conversation with Erin Barnett, author of Endo Unfiltered, in conjunction with the launch of Endo Awareness Month. Thanks for listening, and never stop reading.